Now let me start by saying that everything you're going to hear in this video is based on my subjective opinions and perspectives. Hello everyone, my name is TheiPadCat, and today, like in many of my other videos, we're talking about The Last of Us, which I consider one of the best games ever made, if not the best game ever made. But what makes me say that? What make a lot of other people say that? Of course, ultimately it always comes down to personal preference, but with over 200 Game of the Year awards, continuous love, praise and hype for almost 5 years now, there has to be something more, right? That's where the title for this video comes in. What makes The Last of Us so good? The way I see it, every story-driven game can be divided into 3 basic parts. Now this one might be pretty self-explanatory. A good plotline makes a good story, right? Well, not quite. At least in my opinion. A good story is nothing without equally good characters. Take The Division for example. You have this massive, beautiful open world and interesting story scenario. You're a secret agent with orders from the highest level of government to preserve what remains of an almost 1-to-1 scale midtown New York City. You run missions at well-known places such as Madison Square Garden, Times Square, and the UN building, which all make for amazing set pieces. Only there is one thing which undermines all this: the characters. You, the heroic agent doing all the work, is a mute and devoid of any personality whatsoever. But the ones that do talk are not much better. You've got the 3 heads of the different parts of your base, whose only purpose is to send you out on missions and rarely have any other impact on the story. And you've got Faye, the only part of the division you actually interact with during the story. The villains are largely faceless and not fleshed out at all, except for the leaders of the Last Man Battalion and the Cleaners. Practically the only interesting character in the game is the main villain, which, funnily enough, we never even get to see or interact with, or even know what happens to, since the game ends on a cliffhanger. The Last of Us, on the other hand, arguably lacks any uninteresting characters. Now, I know a comparison between a mainly multiplayer-focused game and a strictly story-oriented one might be a bit unfair. But still, imagine what a little character development might have done for the story of The Division. What would The Last of Us be without the relationship between Joel and Ellie? What if their characters were just cardboard cutouts and never changed even the slightest during the course of the story? What if we reached the hospital in Salt Lake City and still had Joel brushing Ellie off and being the grumpy old man we saw in the Boston quarantine zone? Sure, we'd still have an amazingly interesting world to explore, but the story, even if it had the exact same premise as in the real game, would turn into nothing more than a glorified escort mission with really good set pieces and interesting side characters. It's all about balance. A good story isn't really a good story, regardless of interesting scenarios or plot lines, if it lacks well-written or interesting characters. The same goes for good characters. If they're never put into an interesting scenario or adventure, or whatever, they fall flat. In my opinion, many of the Assassin's Creed games usually do this. They create these really interesting characters, but fall into the trap of making them do nothing interesting but the same cliches and tropes that has been in every AC game since the first one in 2007. This is why I, and probably many others, consider Assassin's Creed Origins and The Black Flag to be such great games, since they do have those great characters, but also do something new and interesting. Immersion. Now there is a word that's thrown around a lot in the video game world. But what is it really? Is a game immersive if it has great graphics? Is it immersive if it's hyper-realistic with complex and advanced controls? Is it immersive if it has a really good story? Now, I have to admit I don't know the scientific definition of immersion. But before you click away, hear me out. Have you ever sat down, booted up your console or PC to play a game for a little while, only to get completely consumed by it and realize hours later that you've played for way longer than you planned. Have you ever been scared out of your mind being chased by a monster in a game, or had tense atmosphere of a level or environment keep you on the edge of your seat? If you have, I argue that you've experienced immersion. Of course, there are many other instances that could be considered immersion, and the ones I just mentioned doesn't have to be immersion either. I mean, you could play for hours on end, grinding towards some kind of milestone or playing against other players in a shooter, etc. Alright, enough about immersion. What does it have to do with The Last of Us? Well, The Last of Us is an incredibly immersive game, and the huge part of that is the world in which it takes place. And by that, I don't just mean the map or the playable space, I mean the entire fictional reality it takes place in. This is one of the things that makes The Last of Us stand out, especially among other post-apocalyptic games. If I had to use one keyword to describe the world of The Last of Us, it would definitely be convincing. Why? Because if you take the time to actually think about what's going on, it makes a lot of sense. A lot of other post-apocalyptic games, and works of fictions too for that matter, usually take the military got wiped out within 2 weeks, the government disappeared, now everything is gone approach to their world building, so to speak. And I can understand that. It wipes the slate clean for them to do essentially whatever they want, and probably in many instances make for some more interesting stories than if they hadn't made everything just die. However, The Last of Us doesn't do this. Instead, Naughty Dog actually managed to make a really convincing scenario of what would happen to society in this sort of situation. Of course, I said the keyword is convincing, not necessarily realistic. I don't think anybody could really predict exactly what will happen, and I sincerely hope we never have to find out. But I find it way more convincing that some form of government would remain even if it's in the shape of a twisted and evil military dictatorship. The way other groups of survivors have reacted to the apocalypse across the USA are also convincing in my opinion. A lot of other games just go crazy with the sort of people you find. Insane cultists or straight up Stone Age-like tribes, even though it's only been a couple of years since whatever catastrophe that brought civilization down hit. I also find the infected quite convincing, partly since the fungus actually is a real one, but also because nothing with them is too over the top. No giant 30-feet zombies or chemical-spitting monsters here. Actually, that is another way of describing the world of The Last of Us. Nothing is too over the top. Clean Prince Gaming made a really good video recently. The Part 2 problem, he called it. It's a great channel, by the way, you should go check it out if you haven't. In this video, he basically talked about how Naughty Dog is attempting the impossible with trying to make Part 2, and I kind of agree with him. Even the Naughty Gods probably can't catch lightning in the bottle twice. However, that is not the point of this point. Anyways, he argued that The Last of Us' only weak point was the gameplay, and that some of it was arbitrary and bland, and that the game truly shines in its cinematic moments. While I agree with the latter statement, I don't at all agree that the gameplay is a weak point. In fact, the gameplay is a huge part of what we discussed in the previous part of this video. The immersion. The clunky, slow combat makes you feel the strength when you punch the crap out of some poor guy, or the recoil when firing a shotgun, for example. It is true that the crafting system only really affects gameplay at the higher difficulties, but it's not arbitrary. It's part of the survival experience. The game intentionally item starves you during the low points of the story to make you feel the same desperations the characters go through. The same goes for the quote-unquote puzzles. Neil Druckmann actually stated that those puzzles are there during the entire campaign for them to culminate in something that furthers the story in the later parts of the campaign, like in the bus depot in Salt Lake City.
Ellie? Ellie?
What? Oh my God.
What is it?
Don't scare it.
I won't.
What are you doing?
It's all right. Come here.
While there certainly can be made some improvements in Part 2, The Last of Us's gameplay feels meaningful, well integrated and related to the world in which it takes place. But that's just what I think. What do you think? Do you agree? Disagree? Tell me in the comments down below and let's discuss it. And until next time, have a good day.